Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the FIDE World Junior Championship under 20 being held in Mexico City. Now, we did check in very early in the event on the #1 ranked seed, the top seed of the event, Hans Niemann, who faced off against his fellow American junior rival, Andy Woodward. Now, Hans lost that game after getting off to a 2-0 start. So with Hans on 2 out of 3, we now will jump back into the event nearly 1 week later. So let's get right into the action. So we're going to be starting with round number 10, which was played yesterday in the World Junior Championship. The tournament is 11 rounds. So Hans, after that loss in Andy Woodward in round 3, he won a couple of games. He drew against some talented junior players, including Sean Rodriguez Lemieux from Canada. And going into round 10, Hans was on a score of 6.5 out of 9, a very nice score, or close enough to it, I should say. And he was paired against another one of the talented Indian juniors, Pranav Anand. Now, there are many different Indian players. There's, of course, the former world chess champion, Vishwanathan Anand. There also are some famous Pranavs like Buddy Pranav, who I think beat Hans in a previous tournament. We did a recap a while back. But at any rate, Hans is on 6.5 points out of 9. He's trailing by 1 point going into the penultimate round, and let's see how it goes. All right, so in this game, Hans is playing with the black pieces against Pranav Anand, I think one of the recent Indian GMs. So the game starts with e4. Hans decides to play e6. Now, Hans playing e6 is definitely a little bit of a surprise. Hans is a player who has not really played much e6. Normally, he's playing openings like the Sicilian, e5, or the Caro-Kann. But he decided to try something new because obviously in this situation, desperately needing to win this game and then maybe win the final round to have a shot at first place, he needs to keep pieces on the board and play something a little bit more mixed up. So we get d4, d5, knight c3, Hans plays knight f6, we get e5, knight d7, f4, c5. All this, by the way, so far pretty standard. So here we get knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop e3, a6, queen d2, and now let's move b5. Now, one of the great things about the Steinitz variation of the French here for black is that there are many different setups. You can play a6 and b5 like Hans does in this game. You can also play queen b6. Even many years ago, there was this line rook b8 that was played by Hikaru Nakamura against Sergei Karyakin in Mexico many moons ago. So you have a6, b5, you also have rook b8, a lot of different setups, and that gives black a lot of flexibility and many options. So we get a6, queen d2, b5. Here Pranav plays h4, Hans goes bishop b7, we get h5, and now of course Hans plays this move h6. Now at first glance you're probably thinking, well, why am I saying of course h6 has to be played? Now the reason is that down the road, if black does not play h6, let's just say black were to play something like, I don't know, rook c8 for example, after h6, g6 is played here, white can play knight to e2, and white still maintains his grip over the center with knight takes d4. Additionally, with h6, g6 being played, f6 will always weaken this e6 pawn down the road, and long term, let's just say you go knight b8, knight h2, and a5 just to illustrate the point. White has ideas like knight to g4, intending to go knight f6 and hitting the king on the e8 square. So h6 stops all of that. Additionally, black has flexibility still to play f6 or f5 down the road as well to try and chip away at this big white center. So here we get the move a3 being played by Anand. Now we get queen a5. Actually, I'm just going to refer to him as Pranav because if I say Anand, everyone is going to get confused. If you're literally like multitasking, you're listening to this background music, and then you're working on a paper or something, and then you're typing away, whatever, and then you hear Anand, you're like, wait, Anand? Wait, Hikaru's covering Anand. So we're just going to call him Pranav for now to be clear about the differentiation. So we get a3, queen a5, rook d1 played here by Pranav. We get pawn to b4 being played by Hans. Pawn takes, queen takes, and now we have this move bishop e2. Now it's a very irregular sort of situation here because Hans has actually broken up the pawn symmetry here. When you go b4 and you take with the queen, now you have this weak a6 pawn, the c5 pawn. You can always trade on d4, but in the long term this pawn structure is not as great. Whereas here, for example, if you could somehow go like queen b6, bishop e2, a5, castles, b4, takes, now you keep the pawn chain intact and it's preferable. Nonetheless, what Hans does is reasonably fine. So we get b4, takes, we have bishop e2. Now we get c takes d4 being played. Hans, of course, has to decide what to do in the center here. Is he going to trade the pawn on d4? Is he going to go f6? Or is he just going to go bishop e7 and castles? So Hans decides to trade on d4. We get knight takes d4, bishop c5, knight b3 played here by Pranav. A solid move here, trying to get rid of any ideas on this long diagonal and offering the trade of these bishops. Here Hans plays bishop b6. We get castles, bishop takes b6, queen takes b6, king to h2, and now Hans makes a mistake with this move a5. Now a5 is relatively okay here, but the computer actually wants this move queen c7, and the reason is basically if white tries to go knight a4 here and no longer hits the queen on b6, but now black can play a move like rook a c8 and try to put pressure on the c file. Additionally, you also have ideas like f6, bishop g4, and maybe rook a e8 as well, and it's really hard to play. Now a computer thinks white might be a little bit better here, but in my professional opinion, I think it's much harder for white to play than for black to play, because you have to decide what you're doing with this diagonal. There are a lot of issues. If you go knight c5, black will trade and then go bishop c8, and again it just doesn't seem that easy to play. Now of course the computer thinks white is very slightly better here, but as I said, I think in practical play it's much easier for black. So Hans plays a5 instead. We get this move knight to a4, queen to c7, and now Pranav plays rook f3, which is an excellent move here with the idea of going rook to g3 or potentially rook to c3, pinning the knight on c6. And here Hans plays rook a e8, and now Pranav makes a mistake with knight a c5. In this position, the computer thinks that white is actually a lot better here after the move rook to c3, and the reason that white is better here is that the logical human move is f6, trying to break the pawn chain in the center. But after f6, white has this very nice idea with knight to d4. Black takes the pawn, and now you sack the knight with knight takes e6, and after rook e6, queen takes d5. Black is in a world of trouble here. You have to deal with this pin. Your knight's under attack. Your knight on c6 is also pinned, and computer thinks that white is simply winning here. One sample line is knight to d4, guarding the rook and also attacking the queen. But after white sacks the queen with queen takes rook, knight takes queen, rook takes queen, knight takes rook, and then rook takes knight, white is simply winning here. White is already up one pawn, but on top of that, black has big issues with both the knight on c7 and the bishop on b7 as well. Instead, however, Pranav plays knight a c5, which is simply a blunder. Now, of course, there are no post-game interviews. There obviously are no live cameras as far as I know on this event, so it's very hard to know why Pranav played knight c5, but this is simply a blunder here. Now, perhaps when Pranav played this move, he thought that after knight takes knight, there was this idea with knight takes e5, which temporarily sacks the knight for a pawn, but black is going to win back some material here. Pranav takes, we get queen c5, rook g3, and I think there's a decent chance that Pranav simply missed this excellent move from Hans, which is queen to c7, attacking the pawn on e5. Without queen to c7, there's a very good chance that white can get a big advantage. One sample line is king to h8, avoiding queen takes h6 due to the pin, but now after rook to f1, and let's just say queen to e7, white has this brutal rook sack with rook to f6, sacking the rook, and now black is simply checkmated. If you take the rook, queen takes h6 is simply GG, why not, with checkmate. And if you play king to h7 trying to guard the pawn, I can sack the queen with queen takes h6, g takes h6, and now there's bishop to d3 check, king to h8, and rook to h6 is checkmate, and black is mated once again. But Hans correctly notices queen to c7 is possible here, because now if white takes the pawn on h6, you can take the pawn on e5, guarding g7, but also pinning the rook on g3, and black is simply much better here after, say, queen to d2, and then a move like I want to say king h8. Computer wants this very dank move, rook to e7, which I don't understand, but I think after king to h8, black should have an advantage. So Pranav plays queen to e3 here, trying to guard the pawn on e5 and still spy the pawn on h6, and now Hans plays another excellent move, which is pawn to f5. Now this is the best move in the position, because now all those ideas that we just saw with rook to f1 and rook to f6 vanish. If you play end peasant with pawn takes pawn after rook takes pawn, black is simply winning here. You're guarding the pawn on h6. You're also going to be able to push the pawns in the center of the board and open up this light square bishop, and it's just GG on the spot. So Pranav plays rook to d4, Hans goes king to h7 here, we get bishop to d3, rook to e7 played, rook to f3, king h8, and now Pranav plays c3. Now in this position, it was imperative that Pranav goes all in here with this move pawn to g4, trying to attack on the f file. If you do not play g4 like in the game, it's very hard to get anything going, and long term, even though black is kind of tied up here and doesn't have a lot of activity, black will maneuver the bishop to e8, hit the pawn on h5, or eventually open up the a or the b files long term and probably win. So Pranav goes c3, we get rook e to f7, queen to f4, queen to b6 played here, attacking the pawn on b2, rook to f2, and now after bishop to a6, it's very clear that Pranav's whole strategy has simply backfired, because Hans is able to get rid of this bad light square bishop behind the pawn chain potentially, and if you don't trade, something worse is going to happen. So Pranav decides to go bishop b1, Hans plays bishop c4, and now we see this great light square bishop for black on c4, and the white bishop on b1 is very passive because it's staring at a pawn chain from e6 to f5. So we get queen g3, queen to b8, rook to d2, rook to b7, and now Hans is double stacked on the b file. White is still not getting any attack on the king side, and this should be technically winning. So we get queen to f4, a4 played, we get bishop to c2, rook takes b2, bishop a4. Hans obviously trades the rooks off here, because with one less piece on the board, Hans is still maintaining his extra pawn advantage, but on top of that, with one less rook, it's going to be almost impossible for white to ever attack on the king side. So we get queen to a7, bishop to d1, we get queen to a3 played here. Now of course Hans is free to move with the queen all over the board because white has no attack on the king side. Pranav plays queen d4, trying to guard both the pawns. Here Hans goes queen e7, rook to f2, queen to g5, and now the house is starting to fall apart here because Hans is a great queen targeting the pawn on h5. He can go f4 and queen g3. You can also reroute the bishop eventually back to e8. So here Pranav plays queen f4, Hans goes bishop to d3, because of course if white trades these queens, now black has these great pawns in the center. There's rook c8 to put pressure on the pawn on c3, and you can even go king h7, king h6 and try to win this pawn on h5 as well. So Pranav decides to trade anyway, goes bishop to a4, Hans plays f4 here, bishop d7, and now he plays another good move, bishop to f5, retreating the bishop and guarding the pawn. You can obviously kick the bishop with rook to d8 next turn, and you can still run the king up to h5 as well. And now of course the game is effectively over. Here Pranav plays g4 here, which simply hangs a pawn. We get bishop takes g4, rook g2, bishop f5 takes, and now Hans plays king to h7 with the idea of playing king to h6 to go after both the rook on g5 and the pawn on h5 as well. And with this extra pass f pawn and the rook behind it, the rest is very basic. The game concludes very shortly. We get king g1, king h6, rook g2, Hans plays rook to b8, bringing the rook on the open b file. We get bishop e6 here, Hans plays rook b1 check, king h2, not king to f2 by the way, because then black would check the king, and after king f3 bishop e4 wins. But also you could simply trade the rooks on g2 and take the bishop on e6 as well. So we get king h2, Hans takes the bishop, rook g6 check, king h5, rook takes e6, g5 played here, and now it's just hopeless. Two connected pass pawns. You can always put the rook behind white's pass pawn, and we get rook d6, king g4, rook takes d5, rook b2 check, king g1, king g3. And even though white has evened up the material with a rook and two pawns apiece, black has a great king placement. You're threatening rook b1 checkmate, and you're just pushing the pawns immediately, and white can't really do much. We get rook d1, f3, e6, rook g2, king f1, rook h2, king e1, and after rook to h1, Hans's opponent Pranav Anand resigns the game here, because after king d2 you trade the rooks, go f2. If white plays e7, f1 queen is with check and black wins the game. And if you play king e2 after king g2, black will get a queen anyway and win the game. So very nice game overall from Hans. He was a little bit worse at a couple of critical moments. I do think that if you've been playing at, say, a 2,700 plus player, there's a good chance that, say, a Fabiano Caruana or Jan Nepomniachtchi, players who played a lot of these Steinitz Frenches with the pawns in f4, e5, and d4, I think there's a good chance they would have spotted some of those ideas like rook c3. But against a player like Pranav, who's rated 2509, recent new GM, it was a great choice because Pranav was not able to find the best ideas or even the best moves, and Hans wins a very convincing game in the 10th round. So with that win, Hans now moves back into the running. He's on 7.5 points out of 10 going into the final round, which is round number 11. Now, going to round number 11, there are 3 players on 8 points. You have Marc-Andre Morizzi, if I'm not mispronouncing his name, from France. You also have this guy Subelge, as well as Budaj Savljevic. Again, probably mispronouncing his names or butchering them like a typical American. But you have 3 players who are on 8 points out of 10. And meanwhile, you have Hans on 7.5 out of 10 playing against Nesterov from Russia. Now, both players on 7.5, so they really feel this need to win to try and potentially join the leaders at 8.5, where there may or may not be a tiebreak. I don't actually know the exact criteria to determine the winner. So, final round, we get c4 from Hans on move number 1, very explosive move. Nesterov plays e6. We get knight to c3, d5, and now d4, and the move knight to f6. And effectively, we've transposed back into a Queen's Gambit decline, but we are going to get the exchange variation after cd5, ed5. Now, one reason to play a c4 order is that if you were to play d4 and black plays d5, c4, e6, knight c3, black does not have to go knight f6 here. Black can also play this move bishop to e7 as well to avoid this whole cd5, bishop cd5, ed5, bishop g5 variation. Additionally, if you played out of the other order with knight f6, c4, e6, then if you go knight c3 hoping for d5, black can simply go bishop b4, and we're in the Nimzo Indian. So Han's very happy to get this exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit decline. Now, one fun fact is for much of my career up until I was about 2400 rated, the only opening that I played was this move 1 to e4, and additionally I also played the classic Trompowsky as well. So I played e4 and I played the Trompowsky, and that was all I did. But I remember at the Pan Americans held in La Paz, Bolivia, I feel like this was maybe 2001 or 2002, of course someone can fact check this. When I went to that event, I actually in the middle of the event decided that I was going to play d4 because there were a couple people who actually played this exact variation of the Queen's Gambit decline or Queen's Gambit exchange, where I could go bishop g5, knight f3, e3, bishop d3, just to show you guys one sample line. Black plays like rook e8, knight bd7, queen c2, I think knight e4, you take, and then you have moves like rook b1, knight f8, and b4 b5 or a4 b5 with the classic minority attack on the queen side, and I thought it was very easy to play. So back to this game, we have this exchange, Queen's Gambit decline. We get bishop g5, c6 played here. We get this move e3, bishop e7 is played. Black can also play bishop f5. Now this was a big contribution from Vladimir Kramnik, the former world chess champion, who actually showed that this endgame after queen f3, bishop g6, takes is probably playable. And again, there are many games at the top level, but Kramnik sort of brought this back into vogue, or fashion I should say. So here we got bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, knight ge2, knight bd7. Hans decides here to castle. Now if Hans wanted to be super aggressive, he could play queen c2 and try to castle queenside, although black does have a lot of counterplay. So we get castles, rook e8, queen c2, knight f8. Now we have f3 being played, the idea behind f3 to build this big white center with e4 in the coming moves. So here Nesterov goes knight g6. We get this move e4 from Hans. Now again, the time usage up to this point you can tell is pretty much is very clear cut. Hans has used 17 minutes if the time usage is to be believed, whereas Nesterov has used basically no time at all. So Hans plays e4, Nesterov trades, goes bishop e6. Very clear that Nesterov's still in his preparation. Hans plays h3, Nesterov goes c5. We get bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and now Hans plays this move e5. Now it's very tough when your opponent is blitzing out all these moves. As you can tell, much of Nesterov's play thus far has been all computer preparation. He has not had to really think, and when you're playing someone who's a little bit lower rated, it's very frustrating when this happens because you perceive yourself to be the big favorite on rating, and when they're suddenly playing all these moves instantly, it's very tough because they're not actually having to think, so their skill level is not even being shown. So after bishop g5, Hans plays this move d5, and Nesterov plays bishop d7. We get e6 played, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes knight, takes, and again Nesterov has basically used no time at this point in the game. He thought for I think one bit of time was a bishop e6, or maybe it was bishop g5 where he thought for 6 minutes, but effectively what Nesterov was doing was trying to recall the preparation and what the right move was. So we get straight to this position here after e takes d5. Hans plays knight g3 here. We get this move rook to e5, which guards both the bishop and the pawn. This move also played instantly by Nesterov. Very clear that this is all preparation. Now here Hans plays queen f7, king h7, queen h5, king g8, check, king h7, before eschewing the draw with this move rook a e1. Now queen to h5 would have been a draw, but for a player like Hans Niemann, who thinks he's going to be the first American world chess champion, someone who is the top ranked player in the tournament as well, if he draws this game, he ensures that he will not get first place, and Hans simply does not want that to happen. So we get rook a e1 played here, and Nesterov plays the move bishop to e8, an excellent move because now white cannot check on either f5 or h5 here, as the queen will be captured, and nobody wants to do a Botez gambit, least of all Hans Niemann. So after bishop e8, we get queen takes b7. Nesterov trades the rooks, and now he goes queen b8. Now these moves, the problem with Hans choosing to decline the draw here is that Nesterov's moves are a little bit too easy to fight, and even though Hans is in the game here, the two bishops in the long term should be quite a bit better than the two knights. So we get queen takes queen, rook takes queen, knight takes pawn, and now after bishop h4, we get king to h2, guarding the knight on g3, and Nesterov plays bishop c6. Now the dust has cleared here. I haven't necessarily gone into depth on these last couple of moves, but the dust is cleared, and the big problem for Hans is that we're in an endgame where we have two B's versus D's knights, And objectively, with rooks on the board, only black can play for the win, because here the knights don't really have targets. If I just put the knight on f4 and get rook takes b2, for example, you look at the pawns, they're very dispersed for black. Even though black has the pawn islands, white can't easily attack these pawns. There really are no bastions. You know, white doesn't have, say, a pawn on c4 to go knight d5, or can't put a knight on e5. So due to the pawn placement here, the fact that the diagonals are very long for the bishops, only black can win. So Hans's idea of trying to play for the win here by not taking the repetition has backfired completely, because now he's in a situation where he's desperately trying to save the game, but only his opponent can win. So Hans is going to have to defend like Magnus Carlsen in order to not lose this game. So here we get rook to e5 to guard the knight. Nesterov plays rook takes b2, and Hans checks on h5. Now at first you're like, whoa, Nesterov has blundered, Hans is going to win the game, tie for first, maybe win the event in tiebreak, who knows. But unfortunately, after king g8, rook takes h4 does not win the game here, because then you lose the knight, and on top of losing the knight, there's a massive threat towards his pawn on g2. a2 is also hanging, and the wooden shield is simply way too powerful here. So Hans plays knight to e4, which apparently isn't best. Computer wants knight to f5 here, and the reason is that if black were to play bishop d8, you have knight to e7, forking the king and the bishop, and white simply wins the game. As such, the only move black can really play is bishop takes knight, but now after knight takes h4, the knight guards the pawn on g2, rook hits the bishop and hits the pawn here, and after, say, rook d2, king g3, c4, knight to f3, black is still much better here, but a computer probably would draw this with perfect play. At any rate, Hans goes knight to e4, and now after bishop to d8, we see the power of the bees here, because the knights look really good in the center, but they aren't actually targeting anything, and you have problems on this diagonal. a2 is weak. There's also bishop c7 looming as well here. So we get knight e to c3 from Hans, trying to create a bastion by protecting the knight on d5. We get king to f7 from Nesterov. Hans plays king g3, and now we get this move king e6. Now computer actually says that after rook to d2, black is completely winning here, and the reason is that white really is struggling to keep the knights connected here. For example, say white were to play h4, black, I believe, can play this move. I thought it was rook to d3. Apparently king e6 wins too, but let's just show this line. Rook d3, king to h2, and after bishop to a5, white cannot keep these knights guarded. The c3 knight is under attack here from the bishop and the rook. The knight on c3 guards knights. If you move this knight, you lose that knight, and if you play rook g5, then you lose this knight and you lose the game as well. So white simply cannot guard these knights here. You don't have any pawns to support the knights, and as such, the bishops win the game. So rook d2 is apparently winning, but Nesterov plays king e6 instead, which is also completely reasonable. One of the other big problems here that you'll notice is that Hans is down 30 minutes on the clock, and he is on the wrong side of this position. Objectively, I think maybe here it's already too late to draw, but he has a chance to maybe save the game. But the problem is Hans is down 30 minutes. He's got a bad position, no chance of winning, and all the trends here are not in his favor. So after king e6, we get knight to f4, king to d6 is played here by Nesterov. We get knight back to d5, because again, you don't really have any good moves. If you play a move like, let's say, rook to h8, black goes bishop f6, and you have no squares available for the knight on c3. All these light squares are covered by the bishop, and the knights are just getting dominated. If you go knight to e2, black can even go g5 here, creating a fossil, because you attack the rook and the knight at the same time, and this wins the game. If you go knight f to e2, you have the same problem. After rook c2, you cannot guard this knight on c3, and if you move it away, you lose the other knight. So the knights simply can't be guarded, and you lose the game again. So Hans goes back to d5, trying to stop bishop to f6, and maybe going for knight to e4 on the next turn as well. Here Nesterov plays king to d7, Hans plays rook to h7, and already here the computer is starting to think that maybe, just maybe, Hans will be able to get that miracle he needs to draw this game. So instead, but unfortunately here, Nesterov plays bishop c7, check. We get knight takes bishop, rook takes g2 check being played here. Bishop guards the rook. We get king to f4, and now king takes c7 is played. Now the computer thinks that black is better here, but if white were to play king to e3, bringing this king back after rook g3 and king d2, it looks very, very unpleasant here, but there are maybe drawing chances because the c pawn is blockaded by this knight, and this is a light square bishop, so you can't just put the bishop somewhere to attack the knight, and for that reason, white should have excellent drawing chances. Instead, Hans plays h4. Nesterov goes king b6, and now Hans plays this horrible move, knight to d1. Now in this position, again after king to e3, the computer does not show a clear-cut way for black to win, and who knows what would have happened. Instead, Hans plays knight to d1 here, trying to reroute the knight and hit the rook on g2. And the reason Hans does this is that he's figuring that after knight to e3 hitting the rook will no longer guard this g pawn, and after say rook a2, rook g7, let's just say a5 and h5, white is pushing p very quickly up the board here on the h file, and there are pretty decent drawing chances. Unfortunately for Hans, when he plays knight to d1, this is not a blitz game where your opponent can only think for a couple of seconds. This is a classical game where your opponent has 34 minutes. And Nesterov uses his time here before playing this move c4. We get knight to e3, and now the bone crusher move, which is c3. Now Hans probably thought after knight to e3, I'm forking the pawn, I'm forking the rook. I mean, black has to move the rook, I take the pawn. Now in this position, even material, 2 pawns, rook knight and 2 versus rook bishop 2, easy draw, I'm saving the game, all the danger has been averted. But as I said, after knight to e3, c3 is played here, Hans is simply lost, because now you cannot stop black from playing c2 and winning the knight. If you take the rook, it looks like a free sack, the rook moment. But after knight takes rook, you go c2, and then black will simply get a queen by pushing p next turn, and it's just hopeless. So after c3 is played here, the game is effectively lost for Hans. So he tries to proceed or keep it going with h5. Now Nesterov again finds the absolute best move, which is king to c5 here. You could go c2, takes rook g7 and rook takes a2, but after h6, rook h2 and h7 a5, this is winning, but still you worry that maybe there's some random king maneuver or something to get the pawn up the board, and it's very easy to see the boogeyman. And if you don't have to even look towards the boogeyman and just play a move like king c5 instead, then why bother playing c2 and maybe giving Hans a glimmer of hope? So after king to c5, Hans decides to play knight takes g2 here. I think this is simply a move basically admitting that Hans is going to lose the game, because there's simply nothing you can do. White is actually almost in Zugzwang here. If you were to play rook to h8, now I will go c2, because after takes, the pawn on g7 is no longer under attack, and with the extra bishop, it's an easy win. Additionally, if white were to play say a3, you can also just play a move like a5 here and just ignore it, and white is effectively in Zugzwang. As I said, you don't really want to go h6 because this endgame would be losing. And so if you can't play h6, you can't move the rook, you obviously can't move the knight even to f5 so you get a queen, then there's nothing left to move other than the king, which I guess you could play king to e5 here, for example. But after king to e5, black can go rook g3, attacking the knight. If you go king f4, there's rook to f3 check, which wins the game because the king can't move to the square because it's covered by the bishop, and once I take the knight, it's GG, why not? And if you were to play knight c2 here, black has a very nice idea with bishop to a4, hitting the knight on c2, and the knight simply has no squares available to move to. If you go to d4, I check on e3, take the knight and win the game. If you go to e1, I simply play rook to e3 check, creating the kebab. And if you go knight to a1, I can just go rook to g1, and this very, very sad knight is simply dominated by the rook and the bishop. So Hans decides to take the rook, and I think mainly just giving up, but also hoping that maybe his opponent would see the boogeyman and think that after c2, knight to e1, for example, if you queen, I've got knight to d3 check for the king of the queen, I win the game, right? Except the problem is here, your king is in check when I queen the pawn. So Nesterov does not see the boogeyman. He does play c2. Hans goes to e3, because of course if he were to play knight e1, even if his opponent were a little bit nervous and worried, he would notice that it's simply a check when you promote the pawn. So we get knight to e3, Nesterov queens, rook takes g7. We get to move queen to d2 here with a very simple idea of going queen to f2 check, forcing the king away and winning the knight on e3. Hans plays rook to e7, so if black goes queen d2 and king g5, now at least the rook guards the knight. But unfortunately for Hans, Nesterov has this very quiet looking move, king to d6 here. You cannot play knight c4, forking the king and the queen, because that would put your king back in check, and your rook has no squares on the e file either. Every square here is pretty much covered. e6 and e8 are covered by the bishop and the king respectively, e4 covered by the bishop as well. And if you play rook e5, many ways for black to win, but the cleanest would simply be queen to d4 check. Bishop and the queen cover the e4 square, king to g5, and after king takes e5, there are no forks in the position with the knight. You can check, but after king d6, you're just down a queen and losing very soon. So after king to d6, Hans resigns, and with this, Hans is trying to mount a miracle comeback and win the World Junior Championship falls flat. He finishes on a final score of 7.5 out of 11. I don't know who the winner of the tournament is going to be. It looks like it'll probably be a massive tie on 8.5 points out of 11. So Hans had his chances, but for Hans Niemann, who was the top rated player in this tournament, to finish in like the top 10 versus competing for first place, it's a big disappointment for him, certainly. Nonetheless, hopefully he will learn from this experience. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the World Junior Chess Championship, which is being held in Mexico City. I will be back with some more great YouTube content in the very near future. We have a very big announcement in the coming days as well, so stay tuned for that. At the end of the day, though, make sure that you do smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys very soon with more great content. Have a great afternoon, you guys. See you. Bye.